Imagine waking up in the dead of night, your body frozen in place as you hear something moving in your room. You try to shake it off, tell yourself it's just the wind, but there's something about it, something in the air that makes you feel like you're not alone. You turn over in bed, your heart pounding, and just when you think you've convinced yourself it's nothing, there it is again. A whisper, soft, almost imperceptible, but you know it's real. For years, I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I was just scared of the dark, but the whispers, they kept coming, and soon, they weren't the only thing I had to worry about. I was just a child, barely 10 years old, when the strange occurrences started. A normal life, or so I thought. A quiet house in a quiet neighborhood. I'd spent the best years of my childhood there, but the more time I spent in that house, the more I realized something was wrong. Something in that house was waiting for me. In the beginning, it was just odd things. Small things that seemed to make no sense. Things would disappear, only to show up in the oddest places. I would hear footsteps when no one was home. And at night, sometimes, I could feel eyes watching me from the dark. But I was young, and young children are good at dismissing these things, right? They're good at convincing themselves it's all in their head. So, I did. But then, it started to feel different. The whispers were no longer the only thing I heard. And the feeling that something was lurking in the dark wasn't just a childish fear. It was something worse. Something that I could not explain. The house was old, creaky, nothing out of the ordinary for a home built in the 1950s. It was my parents' pride and joy. We had a big yard, a swing set I loved playing on, and a few trees in the backyard that provided shade during the summer months. It was idyllic in the daytime, and in the beginning, I loved it. But as night fell, the house took on a different tone, a quietness that felt unnatural. I spent most of my days like any other kid, running around outside, playing with friends, living what seemed like a normal life. But there were things I never told anyone. I don't even know why I didn't. Maybe I was afraid of sounding crazy. Or maybe I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't matter. Because whatever was happening, whatever was creeping around me, couldn't be explained, no matter how hard I tried. It started small, as I said, whispers. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself it was my imagination, the wind, or maybe the house settling. But night after night, the whispers persisted, my name being called softly in the dark. At first, it was just once, and I'd roll over, close my eyes, and go back to sleep. But as the days turned into weeks, it became constant. I would wake up, groggy, in the middle of the night, and I would hear it, clear as day, come closer. It wasn't just a whisper. It was a voice. A voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the walls. It was always soft, always gentle, but there was something so unsettling about it. And yet, when I checked the house, no one was there. I'd call for my parents, and they'd tell me I was imagining things. They'd laugh it off like it was some kind of childhood fear. But the whispers didn't stop. They only got worse. And soon, they weren't just whispers anymore. It wasn't just the voice anymore. There was a weight in the room, an oppressive feeling that made it hard to breathe. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to move, unable to speak. My mind would race with thoughts of what might be out there. Was it just my imagination? Or was something really in the house? And then came the nights when I'd wake up, and I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. My body would be frozen in place, as though someone was holding me down. And there, in the darkness, I could feel something watching me. Something close, too close. I could feel its presence in the room with me, but when I tried to look, it was gone. The shadows in my room seemed to stretch longer than they should. They moved, flickered in the corners of my eyes. But when I looked directly at them, they would freeze. Every night was a battle. A battle between my fear and the growing realization that whatever was in my room wasn't going to leave. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I lay in bed, wide awake, watching the darkened ceiling. My heart was pounding in my chest. The house was eerily silent, but I could still hear it, the whispering. It was getting louder now, closer. And then, something changed. Something I couldn't ignore. I turned my head slowly, my heart in my throat. And that's when I saw it. A shadow, standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall, unnatural, and it didn't belong in my room. The thing didn't have a face. It was simply a dark shape, an outline, with a presence so strong it made my skin crawl. It didn't speak at first. It just stood there. And in that moment I knew this wasn't just a trick of the mind. I wasn't imagining it. This was real. Then it spoke. "Come closer." I froze. My whole body went cold. It said my name again, the same whispering voice I had been hearing. But this time, it wasn't in my head. It wasn't just the wind. I wasn't alone in the room. I don't think I'll ever forget that night. I never told anyone what happened. I didn't have to. My parents wouldn't have believed me. And the whispers, they didn't stop. They never stopped. To this day, I don't know if I ever truly left that house. The whispers followed me. And sometimes, when the night is still, I can hear them again, just on the edge of my mind, waiting. It was supposed to be a getaway, a simple trip to the mountains with some friends, a break from school, a break from life. The idea seemed perfect at the time. We were all ready to escape the monotony of the city, to find something quiet, something peaceful, something we could enjoy together. We found the cabin through an online listing. It was isolated, deep in the woods, and the price was cheap. The perfect place for a group of teenagers looking to escape for a weekend. No neighbors for miles, no distractions. Just a quiet, rustic retreat with a view of the woods and the mountains. We thought we were getting the perfect cabin in the perfect location. And maybe, just maybe, we were. But from the moment we arrived, something felt off. The atmosphere was thick, almost suffocating, with a strange stillness hanging over the place. We didn't think much of it though. It was just the woods, right? But when we pulled up to the cabin, a deep sense of unease washed over me. The place was old, weathered, its wood dark and chipped from years of neglect. There were no lights inside, just the faint glow from the windows that made it seem more like a silhouette than a home. The front door creaked as it opened, making me look scared. The others were eager to get inside, to explore, to start the weekend. But I lingered behind for a moment, my eyes scanning the woods around us. The trees were still, but it was the kind of stillness that didn't feel natural. It was almost as if the forest was holding its breath, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I shook it off. I had to. After all, we were just there to have fun. But it wouldn't be long before that feeling started to change from a mild discomfort to something more unsettling. The first few hours were fine. We unpacked our things, set up a fire, and settled into the cabin. It wasn't much, but it had what we needed. A few rooms, a fireplace, and a little kitchen area where we could cook up something simple. We spent the evening playing cards and telling stories, laughing like we didn't care about the world. But when night fell, things began to change. At first, it was just small things. The kind of things you'd dismiss if you weren't already feeling a little on edge. The old wooden floors creaked as if they were shifting under the weight of invisible footsteps. Every time I moved through the cabin, it felt like the air grew heavier, as though something was always just behind me. I didn't want to sound paranoid, so I kept it to myself. But when we sat in the living room, I noticed something that made my heart race. A door, slightly ajar, leading into what looked like a closet. I knew I had closed it earlier, but now it was open. I glanced around at my friends, and they hadn't noticed. I thought maybe I was imagining things, so I brushed it off and closed the door again. But then, it happened again. The door creaked open, slowly, quietly, as if something was pushing it from the inside. I turned to look at the others, but no one was paying attention. It was just me, the door, and the growing sense that something wasn't right. The tension in the cabin grew thicker. The air felt heavier, colder, and no matter how high we turned up the heat, the chill never seemed to leave. It wasn't just the coldness of the cabin. It was something else. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, watching us, listening to our every move. It was late the next afternoon when we decided to explore the cabin. The idea was to look around, get a sense of the history of the place, maybe poke around in the attic. After all, who could resist the mystery of an old cabin with a dusty attic? We took the stairs up to the attic, which was cramped and full of forgotten things. There were old chairs, wooden crates, and piles of dusty blankets. The attic was barely lit, the light filtering in from a small window in the corner. As I looked around, my eyes landed on an old wooden chest tucked away in the far corner of the room. It was covered in dust, but the shape of it seemed familiar, like it had been left there for a reason. We all crowded around it, eager to see what was inside. When we opened it, there it was, a journal. It was an old leather-bound book, the pages yellowed with age. The cover was cracked, but still intact. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just some old diary, or a collection of notes from whoever had lived there before. But as I opened it, I realized this wasn't any ordinary journal. The first entry was dated over 60 years ago, written in an elegant but shaky hand. The words were strange, talking about the cabin, about strange happenings that had occurred inside. But what really caught my eye were the entries that followed. The later ones, written in a much more frantic hand. Descriptions of hearing footsteps above them, the sound of doors creaking open on their own, and the overwhelming sensation of being watched. But it wasn't just the old entries. The journal described everything we had been experiencing. The creaking floors, the coldness that wouldn't go away, the feeling of being followed by something unseen. Even the door that kept opening on its own was mentioned in the pages. But there was something else, something even more disturbing. The last few pages of the journal were all written in a hurried, desperate scrawl. They described a figure, a tall shadow that would appear at night, standing outside the cabin window, watching them. And as I read those words aloud, I felt a chill run down my spine. It sounded too familiar, too real. The journal ended abruptly, the last entry simply reading, "It's coming. It's outside. I can hear it breathing." That night, we tried to leave. We all felt it, the urgency, the need to get out. We packed our bags quickly, but the cabin seemed determined to keep us there. When we tried to drive out, we found the road was gone. The path we had taken to reach the cabin was no longer there. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, and the familiar landmarks we had passed were nowhere to be found. It was as if we had been trapped. The trees grew thicker, the sky darker, and the feeling of something lurking in the shadows intensified with every minute we spent in the woods. We tried everything, walking, yelling for help, but nothing worked. And that's when we saw it. The figure. It was standing outside the cabin, just outside the window. Tall, motionless, just watching us. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was there, staring at us through the dark glass. The same figure from the journal. We ran. We didn't even think. We just ran, desperate to escape whatever was watching us. We thought we escaped. We thought we made it out, but the nightmares didn't stop. Every night, I still hear footsteps. I hear the sound of the door creaking open, and every time I look outside, there's the figure, standing by the window, waiting. I don't know if it's real or if it's something in my mind, but I'm never going back to that cabin, and I'm never going back into those woods. I don't care how long it's been. Something is still out there, and it's still watching. Growing up, I never questioned my family's history. We were a typical family, or at least that's how it seemed. My parents, my siblings, the house we lived in. It all appeared normal. There were no strange happenings, no chilling incidents to give me any reason to think otherwise. But the more I looked back, the more I realized that something about my family's past had been carefully hidden away from me. It wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I stumbled upon the truth, though it wasn't something I was ready to face. It started when I was going through old family albums. My parents had kept them in a dusty chest in the attic, and when I was home one afternoon, feeling nostalgic, I decided to go through them. I wanted to see old pictures of my childhood, maybe relive some memories. But what I found was far from what I expected. The first few photos were nothing unusual, pictures of family gatherings, holidays, vacations. But as I flipped through the pages, something started to feel wrong. There were faces in the pictures that I didn't recognize. People who I had never seen before, yet they appeared in family portraits. People standing next to my parents, smiling in photos from years ago. Faces that didn't belong. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were distant relatives I had forgotten about. But the more I looked, the more unsettled I became. Each picture seemed to add to the mystery. Why hadn't anyone ever mentioned these people? And why did they look so out of place? I decided to ask my parents about it. I wasn't prepared for the answers I was about to get. At dinner that evening, I brought up the photos casually, asking my parents about the people in the pictures. My mom paused, her fork halfway to her mouth, as if trying to figure out how to respond. She glanced at my dad, and then at me before saying, "Those are just old friends from your dad's side. People we used to know. Don't worry about it." But something in her voice didn't sit right with me. I could tell there was more to the story, something she wasn't saying. I pressed her further, asking why I had never heard about these people before, why they were never mentioned in any family stories, why they weren't part of any of the gatherings I had attended growing up. My dad, usually a quiet man, shifted in his seat, avoiding my gaze. After a long, uncomfortable silence, he finally spoke. "Your mother and I, we made a decision when you were young to distance ourselves from that side of the family. It wasn't something we wanted to bring up, especially not to you kids. There were things we couldn't explain, people we had to walk away from." I was stunned. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "What things? What do you mean?" But my father wouldn't elaborate. The conversation shifted, the subject closed, and I was left to digest what little I had learned. But it wasn't enough. I needed to know more. The images of those unfamiliar faces haunted me. I had to uncover the full truth. The next day, I went back to the attic, determined to find any answers I could. I sifted through the boxes of old things, flipping through albums, letters, and forgotten trinkets until I came across something unexpected. A stack of letters, tied together with a faded red ribbon. They looked old, much older than anything else I had found. I untied the ribbon and carefully opened the top letter. What I read chilled me to the bone. The letters were from my great-grandmother. They described events I had never heard of, events that didn't seem possible. My family wasn't just connected to these strangers. These people were part of a darker history, one filled with warnings of curses, disappearances, and whispers of something not quite human. These letters spoke of an ancient family secret, one that had been buried and forgotten for generations. The last letter was dated just a month before my great-grandmother's death. It was a frantic, barely legible scrawl that scared me. "They are coming for us. They know we're still here. There's no escaping it. This curse, it follows us. It follows every generation. It's never stopped, and it's too late to stop it now." That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with the revelations I had uncovered. The photos, the letters, my parents' strange behavior. It all pointed to something I couldn't ignore. I tried to convince myself it was just a story, something from the past that had no bearing on the present. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in the air, something I couldn't escape. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound, scratching, faint but persistent. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a byproduct of the stress from the day. But then I heard it again, this time louder, closer. It was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, trying to listen. The scratching continued, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible tapping. I stood up, my feet cold against the hardwood floor, and slowly crept to the door. My hand shook as I reached for the handle, but before I could open it, I froze. There, at the end of the hallway, was a figure. It was a woman, standing still, facing away from me. I couldn't see her face, but I could see her long, dark hair flowing down her back. She wore a dress, the same color as the night, and there was something deeply wrong about her posture. I was paralyzed with fear, but somehow, I managed to call out, "Mom?" The figure turned, and that's when I saw her face. My breath caught in my throat. It was the woman from the photo, the one I didn't recognize, the one whose smile I had studied so many times, wondering who she was. But now, her smile wasn't friendly. It was twisted, and as she stepped toward me, I realized the worst part. She had been dead for over 40 years. I blinked, and she was gone. I couldn't process what had just happened. I rushed to my parents' room, but when I opened the door, they were gone. The bed was empty. My heart pounded in my chest, and I ran through the house, calling their names. There was no answer. I finally found them in the attic. Both of them, sitting motionless, staring at something I couldn't see. When I spoke, they didn't react. It was as if they were in a trance, unable to respond. I shook them, desperately trying to get their attention, but their eyes remained blank. And then, my father whispered, in a voice I barely recognized, "It's time. It's your turn now." I turned to the corner of the attic, where I saw it. A figure, standing silently. It was the same woman, only now, she was holding a photograph in her hand. The very same photo I had found in the album. The same twisted smile. And now, I understood. My family wasn't just haunted by ghosts. We were cursed. And the curse had passed to me. The truth was too much to bear. I had become a part of something darker than I could ever have imagined. And now, it was my turn to face the consequences. I don't know how much longer I'll have before it catches up to me. I don't know if I'll ever escape the fate my family set in motion. But every night, I feel her presence. That same woman, the one from the photo, the one who's been waiting for me, just like she waited for them. The curse is alive, and it's following me. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think these events were just a series of strange coincidences, something that can be easily explained away? Or do you believe there's something worse, something otherworldly at play? I'm not sure where the truth ends and the fear begins, but I know I'm not the only one who's ever experienced the inexplicable. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Have you had a similar encounter? Something that defied logic? Something that couldn't be explained away by reason? I'm curious to know what you think, because I know I can't be the only one who's seen things that can't be explained. And if you want to hear more disturbing stories, subscribe to the channel. I've got more to share, and trust me, they'll keep you up at night. But be warned. Once you know these stories, once you let them into your mind, you might not be able to turn back. The more you hear, the harder it is to ignore the things that linger in the dark. You might think you're safe, tucked away in your home, but the truth is, the darkness is never far. It's always waiting. And I'm not just talking about shadows. So next time you're alone in the dark, when the silence feels a little too heavy, remember, you're never truly alone. The shadows are always watching, and they know your name. Stay safe, if you can.